Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third Global Middle East seminar this fall. My name is Onur İşçi, and I work for Bilkent University's Center for Russian Studies. Since 2019, we have partnered with the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and have organized several events, one of which is the Global Middle East seminars or webinars since the pandemic. And we've hosted, I think, 7 webinars since February 2021. And we try to bring together a diverse group of scholars and experts working on the Middle East history, politics, and security. And today's webinar will feature a discussion with 3 distinguished scholars, Evren Balta, Özlem Altan-Olcay, and Amanda Frost. Professors Altan-Olcay and Balta co-authored a recent book called The American Passport in Turkey, National Citizenship in the Age of Transnationalism. It was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2020. And Altan-Olcay and Balta in this book argue and will explore in this webinar that the US global power not only reveals itself in terms of foreign policy, but also manifests in the active desires people have for the US citizenship, even when they do not intend to live in the United States. This book won the American Sociological Association's award for the best book by an international scholar. And for our discussion, the authors will be joined by legal scholar Amanda Frost, whose own book, You're Not American: Citizenship Stripping Down from Dred Scott to the Dreamers, published in 2021, just came out earlier this year. And Professors Altan-Olcay, Balta, and Frost will explore the diverse meanings and values that people outside the United States attribute to US citizenship. Without stealing more time from this lively discussion, please allow me to introduce very briefly our guests. So Evren Balta will start off, so I'll introduce her first. She's a professor of international relations and the chair of the International Relations Department at Özlem University in Istanbul. And her articles appeared in leading academic journals. And she's the author of Age of Uneasiness and Global Security Complex. She's the editor of Neighbors with Suspicions, Dynamics of Turkish-Russian Relations, and Introduction to Global Politics. I'm sorry if I'm missing out any, there's just several publications there, and Military, State, and Politics in Turkey, and many more publications. We're really, really delighted to have you, Evren, here. So Özlem Altan-Olcay will go next. She's an associate professor of political science in the Department of International Relations at Koç University, also in Istanbul, Turkey. Her research fields include citizenship studies, gender and citizenship, gender and development, elite networks in the Middle East, transnational class formations, micropolitics of inequality. We're equally delighted to have you, Özlem, with us. Really looking forward to your presentation today. And we're also delighted to have Amanda Frost, who's the Bronfman Distinguished Professor of Law and Government at American University, where she writes and teaches in the fields of constitutional, immigration, and citizenship law. Her recent publications include The Supreme Court Has to Choose Between Trump and the Nation's the Founders for the New Republic, which was published in the New Republic, The Fragility of American Citizenship, also recently published in the Atlantic, The New War on Naturalized Citizens, and she's the regular columnist for the SCOTUS blog, which I started actually following recently after reading read a couple of your pieces in the blog. We're really, really delighted to have you guys, and without further ado, I yield the floor to Evren for this excellent book. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Onur. We are also delighted to be here with you today. We would like to thank to Bilkent University and the Wilson Center, to you and Sam Hurst for facilitating our participation in this seminar series, and of course to Professor Amanda Hurst, who has kindly agreed to be part of this panel. We are very honored to be teaming up with this great scholars, really, and thank you so much for inviting us again. So as you said in your excellent introduction, our book is about the meanings and values people attribute to American citizenship from outside of the United States, situated in Turkey. Our goal in the book is to rethink conceptualizations of national citizenship, conditions of transnationality, and the US power, as I said, from the vantage point of the lived, everyday experiences of people seemingly disconnected from macropolitical relations. So our book is guided by 3 sets of interrelated questions. Our first question is, what are the values and meanings of US citizenship in an increasingly transnational world? And second, what transnational values and meanings can be attached to national citizenship regimes? And third, what do these meanings and values imply for the way we conceptualize American power specifically, and the way we conceptualize citizenship today more generally? So to answer these questions, over the course of 2012 and 2015, we conducted in-depth interviews with 3 groups of people, all of them residing in Turkey, exploring experiences with, imaginaries of, and perceptions of the status of American citizenship. So let me talk a little bit about which these 3 groups are. The first group was parents who traveled to the US to acquire US citizenship for their children, making use of birthright citizenship. And the second group was composed of US-born and raised citizens who have come to reside in Turkey in their adulthood for a variety of reasons. And the third group was individuals who had the green card or the US passport for themselves, mainly through long-term stay in the US. But at the time of the interviews, majority had come back to Turkey. So out of these 3 groups, we collected an amazing range of stories and narratives. And since we may open them in the conversation that follows this introduction in the Q&A section with Amanda, we just wanted to give you an overview of some patterns that we discovered. So let me ask again, what are the ways in which American citizenship figured in the life worlds of the 3 groups we engaged with? The patterns we could see in the narratives directed us to think about, on the one hand, strategic instrumental values people could see in the US citizenship, and on the other hand, the meanings and identity negotiations the US citizenship facilitated. So both the strategic values and also the meanings or the identity negotiations, I mean, both of them are marked by being situated outside of the US, in Turkey, but our story is not limited to Turkey and can be generalizable to elsewhere. People shared with us stories of how having an American passport had a series of strategic values, and these values were unavailable to the majority of the world's population. And they were also not so apparent if people resided in the United States. So let me talk about what the strategic values are. First and foremost, the American passport meant the possibility of exit from risk, similar to an insurance. With our first group, which was Turkish parents, mothers mostly, thought that their children could escape from political unpredictability in Turkey to the US if need be. For natural-born American citizens, they told us stories about exit from economic risks they faced in the United States. And their stories mostly revolved around 2008 crisis in our case. And they were able to find jobs and build lives elsewhere with their American citizenship. So for Turkish American citizens, they were mainly discussing the mobility opportunity their American citizenship provided, the possibility of changing places of residence, circulating in response to macroeconomic and political circumstances beyond their control. So that was the first strategic value. And the second one is basically about this discourses of exit or insurance was part of a larger narrative of cross-border mobility. I mean, people framed the American passport in terms of the unequal opportunity it enabled for travel internationally and settle almost anywhere with ease. And in the book, we discuss mobility as an important component of global stratification and also class. For example, parents talked about the limitations of their own Turkish passports and hopes for eradicating these limits for their children. For Turkish Americans, they were sharing stories of their transnational mobility and how it expanded after becoming American citizens. And for natural-born American citizens, they became aware of this mobility privilege once they moved outside of the United States. So the third strategic value is this seamless cross-border mobility came together with a third value we could see especially in the two groups, which is upward mobility. Of the kind that would not be available to these groups had they stayed in the US. For example, for natural-born American citizens, they shared experiences of increased purchasing power and status, access to fast trajectory career paths, and hanging out with high-income groups, which they would not have been part in the US. So Turkish American citizens shared experiences of expanded employment and entrepreneurial opportunities in Turkey, which would have been patchier had they not had a past in the US, and less likely had they stayed in the US. So these were the strategic values, but our story, as I said in the beginning, was not only about these strategic values, it was also about their identity narratives. People attached distinct affective meanings to American citizenship and resolved questions of belonging through this status. Parents talked about their aspirations for the children's freedom together with their anxieties for the future of their children, and also their own anxieties of belonging in contemporary Turkey. Natural-born American citizens constantly questioned what it meant to be an American citizen outside of the United States. They attempted to carve out for themselves a place distinct from the majority of US citizens in the US just because they lived their lives outside. And Turkish citizens in Turkey, because their upbringing was in the US, they thought they were different from the other Turkish citizens. And Turkish Americans defined themselves as cosmopolitan individuals, neither Turkish nor American, because they could physically, seamlessly inhabit multiple worlds. So their institutionally recognized connections to both countries became part of identity narratives that selectively borrowed from generalized descriptions of both settings and rescaled beyond the nation states. So Özlem will take over from here and we'll be talking about our arguments and how we really conceptualize all these empirical narratives, identity narratives, or the narratives of the people that we talk to. Özlem, floor is yours.
Sure. So it is on the basis of these patterns of values and meanings that we end up making four interrelated arguments in the book. And the first two of these arguments are on the complex relationship between citizenship and inequality. We start by, just like Evren did, by saying that national citizenships are hierarchically ordered with respect to strategic, instrumental values they can generate, but outside of country borders. So our focus is on what happens to opportunities regarding any citizenship outside of country of origin. And we argue that we should trace these inequalities in the experiences of individuals who practice, who strategize at the intersection of institutions that regulate citizenship, political contexts that affect their lives, but largely outside their control, and individual resources, which are, of course, always unequal. And we say that we need to take seriously how diverse individual citizenship strategies and practices unfold in transnational spaces, always in tandem with unequal proliferation of state powers. So the argument, therefore, is that national citizenship continues to matter today in the age of transnationalism, but we can't really capture its significance if we only focus on what happens with regard to citizenships in domestic contexts. We should consider also, as part of this bundle, the unequal opportunities any national citizenship offers unconfined to official state borders outside of the country. So a good part of the book is about these strategic values of citizenship in specific macropolitical contexts outside of the country, but also locally situated. But then we also make a second argument that complements this. We say that we should also move beyond purely instrumentalist approaches to citizenship narratives and practices, which is something that an emerging group of scholarship is actually doing. And we emphasize that citizenship today is uniquely important, not just in shaping inequalities of instrumental opportunity beyond the nation state, but also in terms of identity negotiations it can facilitate. And we can't capture these identity narratives and identity negotiations if we approach citizenship practices as purely instrumental or strategic. And therefore, our book crystallizes the tensions between one's citizenship status, one's sense of themselves and their belonging for all the groups, but in different ways. So all of these people are negotiating the tensions between their citizenship status, sense of belonging, the way in which they want to describe themselves, but in different ways. And the argument, therefore, is that some citizenship statuses, in this case, the US citizenship, are more capable of resolving these tensions than others. So two arguments, one on the hierarchies of transnational values of national citizenship, and another one on the transnational meanings attached to national citizenship. Both of these together encouraged us, to, as we were writing the book, to rethink the concept of transnational citizenship to begin with. And I'm going to be taking a risk of gross oversimplification here, but I'll just say it anyway. Well, scholarship on transnational citizenship explores identity narratives and cultural practices beyond the nation state, right? And these discoveries are often connected with intensified cross-border mobilities, cross-border exchanges. What we show in the book is that this is a world in which your ability to claim transnationality, to claim the privileges of transnational mobility, is largely shaped by not necessarily these cultural practices that you might have internalized, but by whether you have an institutional bond to a privileged national citizenship, in this case, the US citizenship. So becoming transnational, being able to credibly call yourself transnational is really not disconnected from one's national citizenship status. So there are two things here. Inequalities between citizenship regimes in the way that we have discussed shape individual desires for and strategies to access particular national contexts, but also exist some other national contexts. But there's a second thing. This is not just about inequalities between citizenship regimes in terms of transnational practices and narratives either. Global sorting of citizenship also draws from, interacts with, and shapes locally situated hierarchies. At least, for instance, for this case of this coveted status of US citizenship for all the three groups that we were talking about, regardless of their origins, the opportunity for seamless transnational mobility was a maker of locally specific class and status distinctions in Turkey. So, third argument, conditions of transnationality are likely to be shaped and unequally distributed as a result of, at the intersection of, inequalities between citizenship regimes, as well as inequalities within citizenship regimes. Our final argument connects these transnational inequalities to our particular case, American citizenship, and what it says about US global power. We propose that we can theorize the contours of the American empire today by linking these contours to individual citizenship narratives, again, manifesting themselves outside of the United States. So oftentimes, again, a gross oversimplification, the geopolitical power of the United States is often traced to material inequalities between states, foreign policies, intergovernmental interactions, etc. But we suggest that we can actually also explore US global power through transnational imaginaries of and experiences with America, the idea of America, and American citizenship. These diverse and unequal transnational opportunities, again, unequal symbolic recognition associated with the US citizenship, give us clues about the everyday workings of US global power away from intergovernmental interactions. So in this sense, this is an exploration of the American empire's complex workings that looks at the history of US foreign policy, the history of US geopolitical power as it has been exerted in US-Turkey relations over the course of the 20th century, but also combining it with people's experiences of privilege with and desires for US citizenship as they reside in Turkey. So our argument, therefore, is that these American citizens around the world are the markers of a new kind of empire. This new American empire transcends both macro-political relations and individual strategies, experiences, and narratives simultaneously. When American citizenship is valued and found meaningful for a variety of reasons for different groups of people outside of the United States, the American dream of multiculturalism, of freedom, of upward mobility, of mobility in general, now probably more defunct in the United States than ever before, now seems to be surviving outside of the United States. This is a different kind of border formation. Physical passports expand the US borders to include distant locations through individual imaginaries and experiences of mobility and privilege, but also identity narratives that juggle multiple layers of belonging. Well, that's it for us.
Wonderful. Thank you both for your introduction to your book. And I have to say, I had the pleasure of meeting you both in person. Now, I should have valued that even more than I did at the time. We had a conference in person in 2019 at the tail end, and we did not realize that how rare it would be to see each other in person again. And I've also had the pleasure of reading this book twice now. And I have to say, for those who have not read it, that it is fascinating, multi-layered, and also incredible pleasure to read, which I cannot say about every academic book I've picked up in my life. So congratulations on your success with this book, with the very well-deserved award. And I really highly recommend it as a very readable, enjoyable book at all levels. And as I read it, as I think many people here on this webinar would also, who've had experiences living abroad, I couldn't help but compare it to my own experiences. And it's just a fascinating book that made me think about citizenship from new perspectives. So I have a bunch of questions for you all. There's such a rich topic here, but I want to start with a methodological question because as Evren and Özlem just explained, their book explores this concept of the value of US citizenship in Turkey from three perspectives, looking at three different groups of people. People that chose to have children in the United States, take advantage of the United States. Quite unusual, they're not alone, but the United States is not alone, but it's unusual in its pure birthright citizenship rule that says if you're born in the United States, even if you stay an hour, you are a US citizen. So Turkish mothers took advantage, or families took advantage of that rule. And the reasons why they did that is something fascinating and explored in the book. But in addition, there's additional chapters and exploration of people who are US citizens who leave and come to Turkey, and then people who are Turkish American who go to Turkey, go from Turkey to the US and then back. So I'm curious if you could tell us how you found the people that you interviewed, and the stories are fascinating. And also to the degree that you've kept in touch with them, because so much has happened in both Turkey, of course, but also in the United States to change the way in which both countries are perceived, and identity formation would happen regarding both US and Turkish citizenship and identity since then. So how did you find your interviewees, and have you stayed in touch, and how has their relationship to Turkey and US changed?
Evren, do you want me to start and then you take over?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So actually these groups, first of all, came following consecutively. We started with the babies first. That was the original research question that intrigued us. Why was this practice happening? And there were a number of entry points that we designed. Obviously, this was a practice we could see also unfolding in our own social circles. That was some of the entry points that we used. We also checked out blogs that some of these mothers post and formulate on the web and detailing their experiences and suggesting routes for potential people who want to take to the United States. We actually also interviewed in that process 4 health tourism companies who helped some of these parents, although the parents that we talked with ended up not being those that needed it. Methodologically, for the first group, our initial assumption was that these people would be incredibly wealthy, privileged, belong to the very privileged sectors of the society. But actually, we discovered that there was, over time, over the course of the 40 interviews that we conducted, 3 groups emerged. There was this one group that was privileged, that had extensive experience in the United States by virtue of work or by virtue of schooling. There was a second group who did visit the United States, who had upper class means, but also there was a third group, for instance, stories of people who sold their cars or mortgaged their apartments to be able to do this. The entry points, again, we were trying to diversify it as much as possible. One thing that we couldn't diversify as much as we wanted was the gender. We often ended up talking with the mothers. I think out of 40 people, it was 36 or something. It was the mothers that wanted to have the conversation because it was them who actually traveled to the United States. In the second and the third groups, we sent out, we again initially used our own contacts, but we also sent out emails to listservs that brought together these Turkish Americans or American citizens who lived in the United States, and some of those responded, and we branched out from those. So again, in terms of the Turkish Americans, there was more class diversity even. There was more ideological diversity, whereas with, for instance, the Turkish mothers who gave birth in the United States, we could see this very staunch, secular, urban, cosmopolitan orientation and a sense of belonging to a Turkey, which they questioned whether it existed or not anymore. In the second group, there was this diversity in terms of class. There was this diversity in terms of the way in which they went into the United States. And there was diversity in terms of ideology. We interviewed both secular Turks who became Turkish Americans and also, for instance, people who define themselves devout Muslims. With the third group, again, very much class diversity was there. People described their own origins from lower middle class to upper middle class. There were people who described themselves as 10%, belonging to the 10% in the United States, but there were also people who did not, who came from very rural areas in the United States. There was ethnic diversity. There was some racial diversity, but interestingly, one thing that I can say is that we did not interview anyone of African-American origin. We interviewed Asian Americans, we interviewed white Americans, we interviewed Arab Americans, Turkish Americans, not Turkish Americans for this group, but yeah, that was one thing. So there was some diversity, but very much a lot of diversity in terms of class origins. Evren, do you want to take over from how we kept in touch and Trump?
Sure. Well, 2 things are important, I guess, in recollecting our stories about these people. One is a theoretical or a conceptual point of view, because with what's going on with Trump and what's going on in Turkey in terms of democratic backsliding and the importance of borders becoming more and more, the borders becoming more and more important. The argument that we had in the book in terms, the way that the institutional connection is becoming the thing for citizenship is now more pronounced. So with the Trump as the president of the United States, restrictions on immigration, border controls, and everything that went with that. So all these people are now basically claiming that, okay, see, we were right. This institutional connection with the American citizenship, or this institutional bond with America for our children or for ourselves, is very important. So, and that's something that we claimed in the book. In the past, it was basically this cultural connection with the West, right? I mean, being educated in the Western institutions, going to the American schools, or traveling to the US, being familiar with the US culture or the Western culture was basically part of this claim for distinction, right? So these people claim that, okay, our status is different, or we are really connected to this Western culture, Western society, Western standards, whatever you call, because we are culturally close to the West. And we argue in the book that that cultural connection is also important, still important, but people are seeking this institutional bond. And all these people, with Trump's presidency, as I said, with the democratic backsliding in Turkey, was basically saying that, okay, this is the institutional bond that we have that is going to save us from future risks and unpredictability and this and that. The second thing is that some of them actually went back to the US. This is true for Turkish Americans because they had this institutional connection to the US. They could easily move back to the United States. And specifically as a result of the macro-political changes in Turkey, as I said, democratic backsliding, authoritarian turn, whatever you call, unpredictability, economic crisis, all those things, this institutional decay really made them rethink their decision to come back to Turkey. And they moved back to the United States, or they were thinking of moving back to the United States. But since they had this connection, it really gave them a bit of a relief, because if the things will go worse and worse, they were thinking that, okay, I am a US citizen and I can go anytime. So for Turkish Americans, that was the case, but for the Americans, a lot of them, right, Özlem, a lot of them moved back.
With the exception of those who have been married and who had children here, who have been here for 20, 30 years, those were like very settled. But the younger generations chose to either move back to the United States or elsewhere in the world. Places where the privileges that they associated with US citizenship in Turkey could now be taken somewhere like South Korea, maybe, or somewhere else.
And majority of this Americans that came to Turkey, they came after 2008 crisis looking for jobs, right? So the market was open in Turkey, economy was booming. It was relatively cheap to live here, and some of them were earning wages in dollars. So it was a great deal for them. But after 2014, 2015, the things began to change. Economy began to deteriorate in Turkey as well. So they decided, as Özlem said, to move elsewhere where opportunities are more than in Turkey. So that's it, I guess.
Great. And actually, that's a great segue into my next question. But actually, I'll just take this minute to remind the audience that please feel free to put questions in the Q&A. We're going to have a conversation among the three of us for about another half an hour, but we really would love to hear from the audience as well. And so if you have questions, as you think of them, put them in the Q&A and we'll reach out and ask those questions as we go along. But my next question fits well with what you were just describing, which is, as I read this book, I was struck by the sense that all three groups of people that you focus on are trying to get the best of both worlds. And I can see the value in that. I can see I love that you talk about citizenship instrumentally and the instrumental value, but also in terms of identity and belonging and being citizens of the world, or citizens of at least more than one country, and having that sort of facility with two cultures, if not more, and the value of that, as well as the value of the passport, dual passports, multiple passports. But I was struck by this thought that maybe this does not serve the individual as well as they think. And the example I have of that is a woman in your book, is a woman who, if I've got the details right, I think she won the diversity lottery. So she got a green card and then citizenship in the US from Turkey. She was Turkish. She lives in the US for quite a chunk of time, over a decade, I believe, and then moves back to Turkey, to her own surprise, I think, for reasons that aren't maybe even 100% clear to her, but she was feeling some lack of, she felt some desire to move back, and then move back again to the US in light of some of the changes in Turkey. And I thought she might well exemplify a problem I thought I saw as the subtext to your book. People trying to get everything for their children. So they tried to find the school that would both not be too Turkish or too American, but would be somewhere in between, so the child could be in, including Europe, right, in lots of different countries comfortably. Or people who were in Turkey thinking maybe I should move to the US, or people in the US thinking maybe I should go to Turkey, or I want to give everyone the option to move at all times. So one, I worry that that might be a problem for the individual. They think it's a benefit, but maybe too many choices is a problem. And second, and maybe just as important, is it a problem for the society? If people have the ability to exit easily, is that a strength or a weakness for Turkey? That some of their maybe most energetic, entrepreneurial, educated, and I understand not only the very wealthy, but still some of the wealthiest, have the ability to leave at any time. Is that a problem?
Do you want to go Evren this time first? Let's take turns going.
Maybe very briefly. I think there is a balance that we have to seek between the individual responsibility and collective responsibility. I mean, this is a topic, something that we have discussed a lot with Özlem when we were writing the book, when we were doing the research, and after. And that is because many people right now are exiting from Turkey. They are moving elsewhere, not to the America, not just the Turkish Americans, but people are trying to get a different type of citizenship, and the European citizenship, Western citizenship, by using different means, different strategies. And we keep talking about in Turkey, not just in our case, but in general, brain drain, or the people that we are losing, the best and the brightest, to elsewhere. So the problem here is that whenever we talk about that, we go back to people or to the individuals and claim that that's their individual responsibility. But there, as I said, there's a balance here. It is an individual decision, but that individual decision is basically responding to the macro political changes or the collective, the transformation of Turkish politics and Turkish society. And the individual rationality could only be transformed by transforming those macro political circumstances. So if Turkey wants to keep their best and the brightest, we should not really aim to change the individual rationality or ask these people that they should stay in Turkey, but we should rather target, as we have been discussing, the macro political circumstances of Turkey. Each state that's the thing that should change. Because when we were doing the research a decade ago, maybe less than a decade ago, 7 or 6 years ago, 2015, I mean, Turkey was basically attracting the best and the brightest, right? From Europe, from the United States as well, and that changed. And the question that we should be asking is why it changed and how we can change it again so that Turkish citizens want to remain in Turkey. And I do understand another part of your question is about all this literature on citizenship is basically talking about whether dual citizenship and this exit options is harming citizenship as an institution, because at the end, you basically end up with this citizenship a la carte, right? I mean, citizenship becomes a menu of responsibility and rights, and individuals begin to choose only the rights and not the responsibilities that citizenship comes with the citizenship. That is an important debate that we also engage in the book. But in the case of Turkey, or in this case, it is basically really improving your own country's conditions so that people want to stay and act as citizens of this of Turkey, right? I mean, so maybe Özlem wanna say something more.
Well, I mean, you said it perfectly. So there's really very little I can add, except one thing. This idea of combining the best of different worlds. We have to also understand that this is, for the most part, something that people imagine they can do, something that people hope they can do, but oftentimes they actually don't. A lot of these people don't necessarily have these incredibly expansive options. We're not talking about the most privileged in the world. in one sense. So, and there's a cruel optimism there, cruel optimism that if you make the right decisions at right moments in your time, possibly you're going to expand your world, you're going to expand your options. That cruel optimism may be the thing that you think is harming possibly the individual, but at the same time, I guess my sense from the interviews that we conducted was that people's circumstances change. That specific story you were talking about, that woman was able to change places 3 times over the course of her life because her interpretation of the circumstances where she lived changed. What American citizenship facilitated in that sense was being able to meaningfully respond to those changes. She was not the person 10 years ago. She was not the same person that she is at that moment 10 years ago. So she was able to respond to both the individual change and the macro political change. Yeah, that's, I think, what I can add to it.
Great. And now I want to have a question that goes to just one chapter of your book, one group that you target, which for your study, which is the Americans who moved to Turkey. But it's a theme of your book that while there is hostility, sometimes at the governmental level, or maybe at the level of sort of the national media towards the United States and its foreign policies and its governments, that doesn't translate into hostility to American citizens as individuals, and in fact, quite the opposite. The people you interview in ways that you found amusing and they found amusing were often, they loved that they were treated so warmly and welcomed by most of the people that they met. But what was sort of amusing is they were also given sort of the extra benefit of their simple reputation as American was useful to have in a business meeting, for example. So you describe how one CEO of a company brought a fairly clueless and inexperienced American along with him to meetings so that she could say, well, in New York, this is how we do it, and her American accent. And that was enough to make, he thought, his, smooth out a business deal and make his life easier and make his company look more cosmopolitan. So I was really curious about that. What do you think it is that leads to that dichotomy where there can be hostility at the top that does not translate into hostility at the level of day-to-day interactions? And I know this isn't the topic of your book, but you do mention it. It unfortunately doesn't always go the other way. And the United States can mistake the individual for the group. We're supposed to be this individualistic country where we judge people on their individual merit, which has never been true, as we'd like to have been. But it certainly doesn't seem true at this level. So the unfortunate example I will give here is the view of Muslims, which I'm speaking obviously not for myself or almost anyone I know, but there is a fear in the nation as a whole. Certainly the government perpetuated it under Trump. And I am afraid that individual Americans might not react warmly to someone telling them they're a Muslim, despite the fact that in Turkey, even if they're annoyed with or angry at the US for their foreign policy, they don't react in that fearful or angry way at the American, the individual. So if you could speak to that part of your book, I'd love to hear more about that.
So I'm going to start rambling, say a number of different things, and hopefully Evren will also jump in and bring together some of those ramblings into something that's more meaningful. One thing that I was reminded of when we were conducting these interviews with Americans, so everybody told us stories about how they were warmly received, but they always started the story, I have no problems with anyone. So there was the expectation of a possible problematic encounter because of the reputation of the US government abroad, but individually they never had these problems. And the way in which we make sense of this dichotomy is by resorting to theories of Orientalism. On the one hand, there's a group of countries whose citizens are lumped together with their governments because of histories of racism, because of histories of colonization, because of, the lack of need on the part of the colonizer or the Orientalist countries to learn more about the diversities inside these countries. So for instance, in the case of the United States, US citizens don't really have much of a need or possibly also an opportunity to learn about the diversities in Turkey or the different groups of people or the individual aspirations, etc. But the reverse is not true. What makes these citizenships like the United States, like Canada, etc., also privileged is that they come with the luxury of not being associated with the government. And that, again, is due to a number of factors. That Orientalism does not work in the reverse manner. There is anti-Americanism, but a lot of the times when people say anti-Americanist things, they talk about the US government. There's this wonderful theory, feminist theory, called standpoint theory, which basically says that if you want to understand the nature of oppression, you have to actually look at it from the perspective of those who are oppressed, because they have to understand their own condition, but also the conditions of the oppressor. So I'm not saying that this is an oppressor-oppression kind of a relationship, but that inequality works here as well. People in Turkey are exposed to multiple facets of the United States through a variety of channels, whereas the other direction of causality is not true. Yeah, there was one more thing I was going to say. This is just a story. It's not a response, but I just remembered that in response to your question. One of the things that when we were doing these interviews, one person from the US consulate in Istanbul, or in Ankara actually, heard of our research, and they contacted us, and they basically wrote us long emails asking us, so explain to me this. How is it that we see anti-Americanism so much on the rise, and then you have these desires for and individual encounters where there's incredibly positive interaction with American citizens or desires for American citizenship? We couldn't really give an answer to that, but the answer is, I think, embedded in the question that you're asking. Certain citizenships, by virtue of the power of the government behind them and the history of that power, allow their citizens to stay separate from governmental policies. Whereas in Turkey, that's less of an option.
Yeah, that was a perfect response, but just one thing that really informed us during our research, and a question that really we kept asking really goes back to the person from the US consulate. I mean, Turkey is really interesting in the case that this is a country in which anti-Americanism is so strong, probably the strongest in the world, right? If you look at the public opinion surveys, I mean, you find among the Middle Eastern countries, Turkey is among the first three, or probably the top country. I don't remember. I mean, when we were doing the research, do you remember, Özlem? It was probably the top or in the first three countries with a very strong anti-Americanism, which is shared by the seculars, conservatives, people from right, people from left. It really is a national consensus politically. So the puzzle here is that in a country where anti-Americanism is this strong and has been on the rise, how come people really, all people from all sides, from seculars, conservatives, right, left, everyone wants to become an American citizen? How do they really diverge their individual desires from their political beliefs or thoughts? So that is basically something that we dealt a lot. We asked ourselves a lot, and we said that the tension between this political America or geopolitical America and the individual imaginary America is basically where we need to understand how US power works. This is not something we invented. Post-structuralist, post-colonial writings have been really, like working with this idea of America in the imagination of ordinary people, this and that. And we basically use them a lot as well in the book. But I mean, the way that we apply it is a different angle maybe, but I mean, we did it through the lens of citizenship. But I mean, we kept being amazed with this really divergence or this question, this puzzle, really.
Yeah, I find this fascinating, and as you say, your book, it's particularly relevant and important with regards to Turkey, such an important country and such an interesting country in our, geopolitical dynamics. But I'll just say that I think this what you describe, as you say, it goes beyond Turkey, and I think it's true in so many places where the individual American is treated so well, even though there are strong critiques, sometimes extremely hostile critiques at the governmental level, and often well-deserved. But even whether or not they're not translated to the individual. And I just find that dynamic fascinating in your book as you describe that.
Can I just
Yeah.
add something? This also is corroborated by some of the stories we heard from the American citizens who had lived in other countries besides Turkey. So how they described stories of how they were treated as either spies or celebrities, or sometimes when they started out as spies, but once they were acclimated into the environment, they became the celebrities in the communities where they lived. So it wasn't necessarily something. So these people had lived in a variety of countries in Asia, in the Middle East, in North Africa. So the stories multiplied and repeated the experiences that we were able to collect on Turkey. So you're right on that front.
Well, I'll give a 10-second story of my own. I've lived in France for 2 years. France is not a country where people tend to think even the individual American is going to be treated well for some good reasons, because American tourists can be horrific. But not only were myself and my family treated incredibly well and warmly by everyone, and I would even note people were nice anyway, but the minute we spoke with our American accents in our bad French, people were incredibly lovely to us. And one story I have is I was stuck in traffic. It was on a highway, a man asked if he could use our cell phone when we responded in French, but clearly not native. He was so delighted, he passed the phone to his wife. He'd called his wife to tell her he was going to be late. He said, "I'm talking to Americans. They're going to say hello to you now." And to me, I'm in France. I'm in Lyon. I'm not in some backwater. And I was enough of a special person for him to want me to chat with his wife. And that to me made the experience lovely to be there, but I was also shocked because the US deservedly has some poor reputations in Europe at the moment. France recalled our ambassador recently, and yet the individual people interacting with us as Americans could not have been nicer. And so that was very interesting to read in your book as well. But my next question goes to sort of a bigger theme that you were developing in your talk and your book, which is about this idea of Turkey as maybe the movement of the frontier, because, and this, I'm going to tie it in with a Pulitzer Prize winning book. Greg Grandin wrote The End of the Myth, which won the Pulitzer Prize a few years ago. And he said, the United States used to be a country where the frontier rhetoric was so important. The idea that you would always have an escape valve, an escape hatch. It was a place you could keep going, right? It was such an enormous continent and unsettled for so long. And that, he said, sort of was a way to depressurize the situation in the US politically in terms of race relations and multiculturalism and politics. There was always somewhere to go. And then, of course, we have the rhetoric of the wall. We're not only fully populated, we don't want anyone else, and we're in fact building a wall, right? That was Trump. So what's interesting when I read your book is I thought, well, maybe the new frontier is Americans going abroad. Now, that is a little bit self-centered of the American to say. So I don't mean to be saying like, we should view other countries as more places for us to move to and create more of America there. So I don't mean to say that. But I was curious as to this idea that Turkey and other countries could become part of the expanding American frontier. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Evren, you know the book more than I do, the book that Amanda. So can you start?
Well, not that much. I mean, maybe I can just say a couple of words, then Özlem can take over. Grandin basically arguing that while other countries have borders, United States has had a frontier, right? And that frontier is always shifting, making itself a new, not for just the United States, but for its people as well. It's an ever expanding boundary. It is not a geographical border, as I said, but a more metaphorical sort of, like ever expanding frontier. So the argument that we make in the book is basically very parallel to this. I mean, maybe not a new frontier, but that frontier in the movement of people, in the imaginaries of people, but has always been there. So this geographical frontier that the United States had, or the geopolitical, let me say, a frontier that the United States once had in the period of liberal international order, when the United States was more messianic in terms of its foreign policy, might have ended. We don't know that, sure. I mean, during the Trump period, it might have revoked. Again, we don't know. But this idea of, like the way that we talk about the people, the individuals, their aspirations, their ideals, this American ideal has always been there. And even during the Trump, it kept being there. I mean, it was still there. So I think I mean, Grandin doesn't talk much about this individual component of the American frontier. Maybe after your question, I mean, I'm thinking that maybe our book sort of supports his argument, or maybe complements his argument in a way that we are more talking about this individual, ordinary, or lived experiences of people as an ever-expanding frontier of American power.
I'm going to tell one story and go on with that individual component of this idea of the frontier. And this is the story that we start our chapter on the American citizens. So there's this person, Ethan, I think we named him, in his 30s, who, he graduates from college, who starts a job, and then he doesn't really find it exciting enough, and he wants to do something else, but there's nothing else that he wants. I mean, the things that he can access as jobs in the United States are not the kinds of things that he's interested in. And then he says, and this was a very lively individual who we were interviewing, and there was this light bulb moment, he says, that he could actually get out of the United States just by virtue of the fact that he has US citizenship and he speaks English as a native speaker. He could go anywhere in the world, find a job as an English teacher, and probably make more money in the sense of purchasing power in that country than anyone else in that country, that he had this golden ticket in this sense. And then the same person, I think, went on to describe his life in Istanbul, and he resembled it to this video game, which we didn't know until then, Grand Theft Auto. So apparently this video game is a game where when you start, everything that you have is horrible, shabby, etc. But through creativity, ingenuity, and hard work, etc., you improve your conditions, you expand your freedoms, you expand the kinds of things that you can do. And ultimately, he said that that's how he felt about life in Istanbul. He was in a band, he was in TV commercials, he was auditioning for roles in TV shows, etc. So he had this really bizarre, interesting life that he concocted. And the reason why I bring up this story is that the more these stories accumulated, our thinking was that these people that we were talking to were incredibly critical of US political power outside of the United States. They were incredibly reflexive about the violence of history of violence that US inflicted elsewhere. But weirdly enough, in their own individual narratives, one version of that violence in the form of frontiers, places that you can do, conquer, establish lives elsewhere, was figuring. So there was this interesting moment of contradiction. And that's why we thought possibly that's also part of the American dream, being able to move elsewhere and establish your life elsewhere as a frontier.
I really do think it is, you've sort of raised this really interesting sort of new chapter to the Grandin thesis that I think should be your next book, maybe. I want to note here that we're about to be at this section of this webinar where we would love to get questions from the audience. So Q&A or raise your hand as mentioned in the chat. But before we do, I have a question that goes to, I think your book is very positive about the effects of US citizenship and US identity in Turkey. And so it may be that you just didn't find evidence of this, but of course, sitting here in the United States and having been an American abroad, I'm very aware of the many very negative things about the United States. And I'm curious as to whether they ever cropped up. So I have sort of two questions related to that. One is, did any of the people that you interviewed, the Turkish Americans, for example, did they ever say that they, what we call code switched, meaning they presented themselves as just about all American with one group of people and just about all Turkish and not American at all with another group? Did they ever report sort of playing both sides in that way because they wanted to hide some aspect of their either US identity or even the legal benefits, just the pure instrumental benefits that come with US citizens? So that's one part of the question. And the other is, to the degree that Turkish Americans moved back with to Turkey, did any report, and I don't think you put this in your book, so maybe they didn't, but doing it because of their children? And the reason I ask is because I know many children of immigrants and in the US, and it can be very disorienting for the parents because the parents are fully grown up adults in a culture that's not American. And they come to the US and they think their children are going to be first and foremost Indian or Chinese or Japanese, and they're just happen to be born and raised in America. But guess what? The kids at age 25 are American. There's no other way to put it. They have an important second identity, but the American identity, at least in my experience, is the primary identity. And maybe people will take issue with that in Q&A, which I would welcome. But my question for you is, if I were a parent of a child and I didn't want the child to be fully and entirely American, then I would have to leave the United States, is my view. And I'm curious whether any Turkish parents left America because they feared their children becoming too American.
Maybe I should start from the second part of the question, and you can focus on the first part of the question, Özlem. I think that is a great point, and I am really shocked that we didn't include in the section on Turkish Americans, because this is something that all of the parents, all the Turkish Americans who have kids mentioned in their narratives, their kids becoming too much American and the fear of alienation from their own upbringing. So that was something that we have encountered a lot in their narratives. They were basically facing a double, a dilemma or a choice between staying in America. And in the case of if they stayed in America, they were thinking that, okay, better education opportunities, because this is something they all the time juggled with. If they decide to come back to Turkey, they could only send their kids to private schools, which are very expensive and the quality is not good. But they were thinking that the education system, strangely, the education system in the United States, at least it's free, public schools are better, and they'll get a better education. But that always come with a cost, and that cost is that either their kids becoming more American than they could ever imagine, losing their roots, Turkish roots, and become alienated to their parents. And the second is that they wanted them to be a part of their family network. That was more emphasized, I guess, more than, this fear of becoming more American. Not just this juxtaposition of Turkish culture versus American culture, but it was mainly about losing the family, right? Not knowing grandparents enough, not knowing their cousins. So they wanted them to be part of this family network, which they enjoyed as kids. And they were thinking that if we stayed in the United States, so that would mean they would be very lonely. And that loneliness aspect was basically a constant anxiety and concern for the families, which sometimes sort of reflected in their narratives as being very American. And that is also, as again, not this cultural anxiety, but this anxiety of not having roots in family and this and that. And for the first part, maybe Özlem can chip in.
So yeah, I guess the positive aspects of the being recognized as an American, or identifying as American, might have overweighed the possibility of negativity in the book, but there were those instances. Yes, there were different types of code switching for different groups. For instance, with the babies, with the parents possibly instructed the children a lot of the times. The children knew that they had dual citizenship, but they were instructed not to make a big issue out of it in public. So with the American citizens, I know, for instance, these were the couple of interviews that I did, Chinese Americans, basically, especially in encounters with the unknown portions of the public in Turkey, basically stopped saying that they were Americans, because first of all, they were offended by this very racist question. So where are you really from? Sort of a questioning. But the other thing was, when they said, I'm Chinese, that encounter completely stopped. You could avoid unpleasant encounters in the public space because people didn't really have anything to say about China. So there were ways in which people code switched in that group as well. With the Turkish Americans, I don't think at the moment of the interviews that was there, because a lot of the times I think one of the selling points for their employment, for their careers, was the fact that they had this mobility and they could go elsewhere, and they had this experience in the business experience in the United States. But possibly after we conducted these interviews, now the last interviews we conducted were, I think, in 2015, so it's been a while. So things might have changed for them too, in the sense that if Turkey has become more authoritarian, then the rhetoric of compradors, rhetoric of inside enemies, etc., might also have become powerful. So they might have started code switching as well, I guess.
All right, that's fascinating. And now we're going to turn over to audience questions. And I think Honor has some questions as well, and perhaps there are audience members with hands raised. And we're very happy to hear from questions from others. So this is your chance.
Yeah, I was going to abuse my role as moderator and jump in with a couple of questions because it sounds so familiar. I feel like a subject of your talk, but Eliza George, our colleague from the Bilkent IR department and Center for Russian Studies, has her hand up, so I'll allow her to go first.
Thank you, Honor. I'm actually happy if you want to go. I don't want to interrupt. I can wait.
No, please go ahead. Yeah.
So it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you very much for the very interesting presentation and for the discussion. I really enjoyed it. I am going to channel one of my students in my question because we were discussing nationalism not too long ago in my international security class. And one of them was giving us the example of Turkish kids from Turkish families that left Turkey and went to Germany and didn't really fit in, and they are sort of stuck between being German and being Turkish. In your research on the US, have you encountered any examples of individuals of children of families that moved from Turkey to the US, and the children of these families also felt kind of stuck in the middle, or maybe not belonging in Turkey, but also not belonging in the US? And if that is the case, here's my student's question. What is that? How do we explain it? I tried to explain it as an immigrant myself. I think that's just being a second generation, or perhaps even if they came in when they were young, maybe being a first generation immigrant, but maybe there's something else that I'm missing. So I would very much appreciate your input on this question. Thank you.
Evren, you know those stories of children of Turkish Americans a bit more than I do, but I could just start by saying possibly there's one thing that we have to differentiate between the two migration patterns. So the Turkish migrants who moved to Europe in waves, starting with mid 20th century, came from very different class origins than the ones who moved to the United States. So the kinds of ruptures, the kinds of in-betweenness they experienced, probably there were some commonalities in the sense that you move and you change, everything changes. But at the same time, because of the class and status positions, higher class and status positions of Turkish migrants to the United States was much higher than overall than those that moved to Europe. That sense of not belonging elsewhere, I'm assuming that would have probably felt much worse, much stronger for people who moved to Europe, to Germany. But for stories,
may I jump in?
Sure.
Just my personal story. I mean, this is not in the book, but we keep encountering the same pattern as scholars who are traveling to Europe and to the US. Whenever we go to Germany, for example, and we talk to a German in English, and when they find out that we're from Turkey, they're like, "Oh, you don't look like Turkish. You're not Turkish. You don't act like you're Turkish." And this and that. So being Turkish is not cool in Germany. You sense that. And if you're acting cool, if you speak Turkish, if you don't look like, like coming from a lower class origin, and more intellectual in a sense, then you're not Turkish in Europe, right? But if you go to the US and tell someone that you're from Turkey, being from Turkey is still, it's just a little bit less right now. It's still a cool thing, right? Oh, you're from Turkey. We like Turkey. We love Turkey. Used to be like that, maybe 5-6 years ago. And the host culture host country's culture towards that immigrant group is very important. And the reason that Europeans basically, the kids of the people who migrated to Europe really had this, even from their, even if they're from, educated families and this and that, it is also related to this image of who the Turk is, or what means to be Turkish, right? In the host country's culture.
Yeah, so that sense of, I guess, outsiderness, a lot of these people, and when we looked at the statistics of people who moved to the United States, they actually always coalesced around urban centers in the East, for the most part, already very cosmopolitan spaces. So I don't remember exactly stories of kids feeling lost between the two cultures, but there was one person whose mother brought her back, and she was unhappy about having come back to Turkey, not having left the United States, but she felt out of place in Turkey and not in the United States as much. But it could be that cruel optimism we were talking earlier, the grass is greener always on the other side, maybe. There's this one term that they use in international offices, advising offices in colleges in the United States, third culture kids. Possibly this is also a case of that, not being able, having your own culture that is neither the culture of your parents nor the culture of the places where you live.
Thank you so much.
Maybe why I'm so eager to answer this question, I don't know. Maybe because of my personal experience and being lived in the US, and always thinking about this idea of being an immigrant in the US. I always compared my experience to my friends from Mexico, for example, which was very different. And not being known, Turkey is not that known as well in the United States. So that helps a lot, actually.
So I just want to remind our audience again that you can use the raise your hand feature or type in your question in the chat box. And unless there are any more questions, I'll be abusing my role right now for just very briefly for 2 seconds, because I've been listening to this really interesting conversation and felt like a subject like Evren of your book, because my own personal experience resembles a lot. And I want to make maybe 1 or 2 comments and then ask a question about the changing political conjuncture and your methodology, right? My own experience is very similar to yours, Evren. I lived in DC for almost a decade and on and off in the US since 1999 until about 2014-15, when you correctly pointed out that a lot of people were coming back through this form or another. And yes, institutional connections matter. But to this day, for the past 7 years, I receive this question from my students a lot. Why have you moved back? What is wrong with you? And it's hard to explain that, because it's very personal and is based on different lived experiences, I guess. And it must have been, I imagine, very difficult for you to filter that and to give it a frame, right? A mold, if you will, of very different, diverse groups of people who either returned, and maybe a sequel to your book, that was my comment, would be the story of the returned. Repatriated or expats. That's different. And you've alluded to that by saying that some people actually are here already with green cards, some or passports, some of whom I'm very closely affiliated with or familiar with. But I guess from my understanding was that, and I volunteered for the Assembly of Turkish American Associations in DC for about 5 years. I was a projects coordinator there, and I worked with, and this is an umbrella organization in DC that hosts about, at one point, 65 chapters all across the United States. And I was on, this was 15 years ago. So I was on the phone with various peoples. I want to ask about people's and judge if I'm right. So you said secular versus more devout. Özlem, you said that you had the ability, you had the opportunity to speak with different groups, secular Turks, what we might call white Turks if they're young, right? Versus more devout people. Did you, my own experience, and I want to ask, I never thought of this in scholarly terms, but my day-to-day experience for 5 years with really well-educated, upper middle class to upper class Turkish Americans were that their nationalisms on the one hand got really sharpened over the years. And I'm talking about a generation that's probably, above like 60 or 70 years old right now. And they would be the ones who are clinging to more Turkish nationalist causes on days that are, important for Turkey and in DC, et cetera, versus the more devout ones that grouped under and hung out with different groups. I guess that's one thing that my methodological question was: how were you able to bring those groups together and reach a conclusion? And the second one is about the changing political climate. Amanda correctly pointed out that, after the Australian fiasco scandal, you name it, France and the United States have problems, but particularly with the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. Not only do I see the attitudes of people who returned, like myself, to Turkey, changing towards their own countries, but also we were just having this conversation this afternoon, actually, with a friend who was thinking of returning. And he said, particularly after all of this, like when I look at the next 20 years, his feelings have always been, he's from Üsküdar American College or Robert College, whatever, trained in the US. He was adamantly opposed to returning, and he actually chastised me and my friends who were returning at the time. And today I saw him, I met with him, and he was very disillusioned, and he wanted to actually kind of thinking of going, coming back. And so I guess this political climate, when you did your research, you said that this was 2015, 2016. Now, this is going to be a little bit speculative maybe, but do you think that the people that you interviewed would have given you different responses? Thanks.
That's a long question. So I'm going to start by not answering it and just throw out a joke and then build on to that. So this question, one of the themes that you brought up is this question of return and the fact that you are not able to answer when people ask, why the heck did you return? And that was something actually that came up a lot in the interviews with the Turkish Americans. And the thing that they said most was that when people ask this question, this is not a question. People are not interested in listening to the response to this question. They're interested in basically telling you in a politically correct manner that you have been an idiot for having returned. And and the entire chapter is basically, that's why we built the entire chapter around the idea of circulation or hope for circulation, because these people have returned. The political climate was changing, wasn't as acute as it is today, but the fact that it was changing made them question their own decisions to return as much as these other people who have been questioning them since they returned. And they basically said that at least I have, this opportunity of circulation going back. But there was something that was opportune for us in that question. Both Evren and I, we returned from the United States around the same time in 2007 or so. And we were both faced with the same question: why did you come back? What was the rationale? And the entire book actually is based on the experience of us being asked, why did we not go back to the United States? I mean, we returned, we were stupid at one level, but why didn't we go back to the United States to give birth to our children there? And when we realized that we were both being asked this question, that was the inspiration for the book. So the question of return at least inspired the scholarship, I would say. In terms of these rituals, in terms of the divisions between Kemalist nationalists or secular nationalists versus those who are more on the conservative side or more devout Muslims, etc. It's a complicated question. I'm just going to guesstimate something. Part of the reason I think these rituals, singing of certain marches or participating in certain national holidays becomes important, social movements theory tells us, because those rituals are a way to resist and bond the people who resist. So I'm guessing that when diaspora engages in these rituals more and more, there are two confrontations, subtle confrontations happening at the same time. One confrontation is being against being misrecognized in the United States, that they don't want to be lumped together with other groups that they don't want to be, part of. And the second thing is they are resisting what they see as hegemonic narratives of what it is supposed to be, or what Turkishness is supposed to mean today, coming from Turkey. Methodologically, how do we bring those two groups together? Well, there's a way in which they were wax poetic about certain freedoms they had in the United States, regardless of their ideological position. Evren, would you like to take over from there?
Well, you responded perfectly. Maybe something about the changing political context that Onur mentioned. Well, we were doing the interviews in 2015, and it was the period that we already had Gezi protests. And the majority of the Turkish Americans specifically were supportive of Gezi, and some of them were basically among the protesters as well. So it was already apparent for them that Turkey was on the way or path for democratic backsliding. So they were mentioning that the conditions, the macro political conditions in Turkey were changing, and they were anticipating the worst. So it was already there in 2014, 2015, but most importantly, specifically for the first group, Turkey already changed in 2002. Right. I mean, because their concern was more about religious Turkey, right? And we all know that Turkey, this anxiety of Turkey becoming an Iran, and the girls should be sent home, not being educated, and all those, imaginaries of living in a very conservative, radically conservative Turkey was already there. And they were very anxious about that. So, I mean, for some people, and that was already, I mean, it was, again, a lot of people, I mean, almost half of the people, it was the political landscape, democracy, authoritarianism, changing conditions, and this and that. But almost all of them as well, not all of them. I mean, I cannot really give you the percentages. Maybe Özlem can give you the percentages better than me. But for most of them, Turkey was already deteriorated. It was already a very conservative, religious country living under a religious government, and they were expecting the worst to come. And one of the reasons that they went to the United States to give birth to their kids, especially if they were expecting a girl, was this anxiety of becoming a conservative religious country.
So I want to make sure we get to some questions. Oh, sorry, Ona, were you going to do that? Yeah.
I don't mind. I was just going to remind everyone that we have 6 minutes left. Our events generally end sharply. And Amanda, you're right. There are a couple of questions. I'll leave the longer one to you, but there's one about your research did not include Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, right, Evren? So we'll skip that one. And there's one for Eliza, George, that is, what about the situation between Romania and Turkey? We could come back to that if we address a question from the anonymous attendee, which I'll turn back to you, Amanda.
Yes, and I like this question because what it's doing is your book is beautifully intertwines the idea of the instrumental citizenship with the identity and belonging and affective aspects of citizenship. And this anonymous attendee has a question that says, basically, could it be that there's less affection for the US and it's much more instrumentalist? And did you see people or talk to people or hear of people who were maybe anti-American in the sense of not liking much about the country, but wanted the privileges and were very clear that that was their goal in getting US citizenship?
It was a mixed bag, I would say. And a lot of people did talk about horrific policies of the US government. A lot of people said that, but there was always this comparison aspect. One of the things that came up very strongly, let me bounce back to this word of unpredictability that Evren mentioned a bit ago. A lot of people argued that no matter who is in power in the United States, there's a sense of predictability. There are certain institutions that are bound to work because they are strong. Now, this is in comparative framework. I know, Amanda, you're smiling right now, but compared to the experiences in Turkey, they said that a lot of the institutions here are emptied out, and with one push, basically, the entire deck of cards goes down. But that, they thought, was not the case in the United States, no matter who is in power. A lot of people were very much critical of the US government. This was true for the mothers, this was true for, but they had this separation of what the US government does in the distance and their everyday life, and the expectation that it's not going to be affected much by it. There was one thing that I always find very funny in the book is that a lot of the mothers, for instance, started, not a lot, but a few mothers at least repeated this, started their explaining to us why they went to the United States to give birth to their children there by saying, well, Turkey is not Switzerland. So they were expecting some sort of a Switzerland-like type of mirage. Obviously, US is not Switzerland either, but the idea was that somehow there's a predictability there. There is still some strength of institutions there that was separated out from the US government.
Maybe, I mean, just something that I want to say about this instrumental versus, identity negotiations. I really like this book, and I always refer to it, David Leighton's Identity in Negotiation. And what he basically says that in this nationalizing states of the post-Soviet, post-socialist sphere, what the people basically do is that they strategize, right? I mean, they do and get citizenship strategically, but always that strategy comes with an identity negotiation. I mean, they always shape and change their identities, even though there is an instrumental strategic notion of getting a dual citizenship or getting another type of citizenship, but it always includes sort of a meaning, a negotiation over identity, specifically, even if not for the first generation, definitely for the next generation, it would mean something else. So I think that's the case for globally, transnationally. When people acquire a second citizenship, they may do it, or they may think that they are doing it on instrumental or strategic reasons. But in the background, there's always this negotiation, identity negotiation that they keep doing.
And on that note, I think we're getting really close to the end of our webinar. I'd like to thank again to Evren, Özlem, and Amanda for this wonderful panel. Thank you for your time. It's an amazing book. Very briefly, I did share the book's promotion code somewhere. If you apply it through November 24th, you'll get a 30% discount. Thank you, Elisa and Sam. It was great seeing you. I want to close on that note with our next and final event of the fall semester. And thank you to our partners at the Wilson Center in History and Public Policy Program, Kishore Osterman, Kian, Trion, Tracy, thank you for the wonderful coordination. Our next and final event will be held on December 14th. We're going to be hosting Hannah Note and Chen Kane, the ACRS Oral History Project and Exploration into the Arms Control and Regional Security Working Group. We look forward to seeing everyone there. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you for having us. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, Amanda.